Again, my name is Rob Perrons, and our topic today is Frugal Innovation for the Resource and Energy Industries. A quick overview of where we're going to go with my 35 minutes or so budget. In only a slide or two, I'm going to shed a little more light on who I am. She alluded to a few points about my CV, but I spent far more of my professional journey outside of QUT than in it. So to help you understand why does this guy look at the world the way he does, I want to just add a little bit of detail around that. Then I want to, in only a few slides, try to impress upon you the important role that these industries have in the Australian economy, and indeed specifically in the Queensland economy. We're not just talking about some esoteric point for its own sake. This is materially relevant to the economic well-being of this state and of this country. And then I want to explain why innovation has, the war drums are getting hit harder and harder and louder, calling for more innovation in these industries. Why is that? What's happening? And then I want to talk about the last few months or a year or so. What's changed? There's been some huge changes in these industries, and we need to respond to those changes. And then finally, I'm going to finish off with 6 strategies that capture the essence of this idea called frugal innovation. So with the narcissistic bit up front here, the who am I part. So as she said, so I'm currently a professor at QUT, but it wasn't always thus. Prior to 2011, for the first half of my career or so, I worked for Shell International. And the most relevant, the most germane parts of that journey are I was executive coordinator for the global R&D portfolio for the upstream technology portion, working in The Hague, kind of working on the digital parts of technology development and deployment called the Smart Fields program, and also looking at capability development as manager of learning development for the Western Hemisphere. Since coming to QUT, I have kind of also had a lot of extracurriculars that I've really been spending a lot of time and putting a lot of energy into. I take a lot of pride in the fact that I'm very industry facing. Probably that comes, I think, naturally because I kind of started in industry and kind of segued over here. So that's kind of, you kind of see this who's who roster of the companies I've been engaging with over the years since I've arrived at QUT. Among them, some obvious ones, like if you're talking about the resource sector, the Rio Tintos of the world, the Santoses, that makes sense. You might be looking at, why Microsoft, why Intel? Well, just like you've got resource companies that are trying to fumble their way into the digital era, you've got digital companies that want to help them. So to help facilitate that conversation, I kind of play, mediator when digital companies want to talk to resource companies too. Culminating recently, I was added to the United Nations Expert Group in Resources and Energy. So again, moving on to the point of why is this so relevant? Why is this something we should really be paying attention to? That northeast corner, what I want to draw your attention to with this figure, and I apologize to the folks in the room because this is, all but unreadable to the folks who are here in the room. But what this figure shows is that even however narrowly defined, you might want to, how do we define the mining sector? In the narrowest of definitions, it is between 9 and 10% of Australia's economy. That's just mining. Now, the energy picture is a little harder to see in this figure, but it comes into focus better when we add this one. What this shows is that in addition to all the excellent mining work that's going on in Australia, the energy picture is also quite significant. In the northwest part of this figure, you see a little wedge for liquefied natural gas, LNG. Now, Australia, until very recently, was the #1 exporter in the world of LNG. We've recently been supplanted by that role, by the country of Qatar, but only just. So there's this, win by a nose horse race going on between Qatar and Australia for who's #1, who's #2, and it's kind of been going back and forth for a little while now. But the punchline there is that this is a huge industry for us. And more surprising still is the fact that 10 or 15 years ago, that industry didn't really happen at all in Australia. It's kind of come from, literally from zero to hero in half a generation. And it's not enough to tell you the absolute terms and the absolute relevance of what's happening. It's also important to impress upon you that this has been on a growth trajectory, and notwithstanding some short-term hiccups we've had over the last few months for obvious reasons, I don't think that that's going away anytime soon. So it's big and it's getting bigger. It's been important historically and it's only getting more so. So let's talk about the imperative for innovation. One of the trends that we see happening globally is that energy companies, particularly those that have been historically based on fossil fuels, like your Shell, your BP, your ExxonMobils, these companies they're realizing very quickly that they have to adapt or die. They have to raise their game. They have to become, with the parts of their operations that are probably going to continue to be fossil fuels, they have to figure out a way to get to net zero. So if we're going to produce carbon, what are we going to be able to do with that? Can we capture it? Can we sequester it? Can we put it in a place that's going to be less malevolent than just shooting into the atmosphere? While at the same time, also trying to figure out in tandem, how can they transition to green and clean energy sources? So that's what's happening with many of the international majors, and we're also seeing headlines. That Santos headline was from yesterday's Australian Financial Review. Even the mid-caps, the mid-size, the Santoses of the world that are kind of more Australia-specific are also thinking and acting that way. And I kind of talked, in the last slide about how it was like the fossil fuel industry problem, but the mining community is not exempt from that discussion. These headlines are about mining companies, also from newspapers only a few weeks ago. We're seeing activity in the marketplace where Australia's banks are basically saying, we are not going to we're not going to put up money anymore for mining projects that look ecologically dubious. We're just not going to give you the money for that anymore. And we're seeing pledges by large mining companies with ambitious greenhouse gas reduction mitigation targets for relatively aggressive time horizons. So all over the resource sector, we're seeing this trend of we've got to do better. But even before that happened, there was an important trend afoot here. Now, I've got in this figure here deep water milestones in the Gulf of Mexico and Brazil. You might be thinking, how bad exactly is this guy at geography? Does he fail to realize that this is nowhere near Australia? That's not my point. The point is this. I fell in love with this figure several years ago, and I've been kind of dragging it around with me for a while now, because it tells a very important story. It's a very good proxy for kind of an industry-wide phenomenon that's happening. If you kind of look left to right, what you see here on this figure is kind of the gradual deployment of different deep water technologies in the Gulf of Mexico. And here's that story. The story basically is, in the early days, you go for the stuff that's shallower, that's easier to get to, that's in reservoir bodies that are, most of it's in one place and contiguous and kind of nice and convenient for you. But then you run out of that. And then you got to go a little bit deeper. And it gets more technologically ambitious, harder to get to, more capital intensive. And then you run out of that and you get a little bit deeper, and so on and so forth, rinse and repeat. Now, I've put this in front of friends and colleagues who are kind of closer to the coalface, literally and figuratively, in the mining sector, and said, is this consistent with what you see happening in mining? And I see nodding heads here saying, yes, that's true. The ore bodies are getting deeper, more elusive, harder to get to market. It's only getting more challenging. The technical reality of what we're trying to do in these industries, it's getting harder, it's getting more expensive. And that trend is only going in one direction. And then we've got this guy. Now, he'd be right at home in northern Canada, where I'm from. I realize there's not a lot of these wandering around the streets of Darwin, so let me explain why this picture's here. So, I don't know how much you know about polar bears, but one of the things that's happening is that they are they're not quite to a point of extinction, but they're certainly a distressed population. The reason for that is that how they feed is that they basically sit on the edge of an ice floe, waiting for seals to go by or waiting for some kind of suitable edible thing, and they kind of jump in the water and then they eat it. But the problem is that because of global warming, that the expansion of the ice and the refreezing of the sea and everything, that isn't happening the way it used to. And as a result of that, their ability to feed themselves is not doing so well. And so polar bears are really starting to feel the pressure on their populations. I use that as a bellwether for the fact that, habitats and animal populations, wildlife populations of many kinds, all over the world, we're starting to see evidence that, our economic activities have had negative effects on these ecologies and animal populations. And so the polar bear story, it's an exemplar of so many others that are out there. And there's this expectation on the part of society. They're saying it's not enough that storyline that you used to feed us in the 70s and 80s with hey, we're just the dig it out of the earth guys. We're just the company that's not the ecology and the environment. That's not really our thing. And society and our customers and the host governments where we operate, they're saying that's not good enough. You have to do better. We are insisting that you start caring about this stuff, that you start actively managing it. And that's now part of the things that we have to be very concerned about, that historically that was probably less true. Okay, so I've explained to you up until this point why innovation has to happen. There are some tectonic changes that need to happen. And let's talk about why that's going to get pretty tricky. What's changed? Well, here's a headline from the last few weeks in the Australian Financial Review. I have some distressing news. The government is, well, broke's an extreme word, but we're, we can see broke from where we are, right? So it's, we're taking on levels of public debt that are, kind of generational types of events. From reading this morning's headlines, it sounds like we're seeing some green shoots in the economy. Things are starting to perk up a bit, and that's all great. It's going to take some while to repair this. This is let's make no mistake about that. And if we look specifically at the list of companies that I've been talking about so far, let's kind of talk about how their numbers are looking these days. I mean, I thought about adding a specific slide just to talk about the obvious one. Negative oil prices? Are you kidding me? You go through all that effort to dig up a fluid from the bowels of the earth, you put it in front of the customer, and then they demand that you pay them money for the privilege? Unbelievable, isn't it? But that's where the market was only a few months ago. That's how topsy-turvy, upside down, bizarro world this all looked. Let's talk about some of the other smoking gun bits of evidence that are out there. ExxonMobil had been a darling of the Dow Jones Industrial Average for over a century, and they were just unceremoniously shown the door. They are no longer a Dow company. Shell had not failed to pay a full dividend since World War II, and they failed to pay a dividend, or they had a seriously reduced dividend for the first time since World War II. ExxonMobil, a company that whatever your feelings about ExxonMobil might be, what we do know is that historically they've done a really good job of taking care of their people. They just announced a few weeks ago that they will no longer be offering 401k matching for their employees. That is to say, to put it in Australian parlance, sorry folks, we don't have the money to match the superannuation contributions that we used to give you. These are companies that have been, these are companies that are name brands, that their logos are everywhere, and this is amazing news. This really is the canary in the coal mine that things are not quite right in that sector. So, all that to say, whether we're talking about the constituent companies in these industries, and I recognize that mining's done better than the energy companies, or whether we're talking about the purse strings of the public and the governments that are behind these things, or even the individuals in society, many of them are distressed too. There's a lot of broke going on. We're gonna need belt tightening of a kind and an amount and to a degree that really we haven't seen for a very, very long time. But here's what's interesting about that. Let's put those two things side by side. Yeah, we're broke. No argument there. However, the causes, the catalyst for why we need to get the innovation done, a lot of those were driven by things that were physics, chemistry, right? Climate change, the relentless, the constantly getting harder and deeper. Those aren't going away. Those technical realities don't care that we're broke. So we can't stop innovating. The innovation has to continue. The dilemma in front of us then is how can we continue to do this, but with less money? Because Lord knows we got less money. So how do we do that? Well, never waste a perfectly good crisis. If we look back at the long arc of history, one of the things that we learn is that it's in those moments of destitution, when everything is blown asunder, when everything is completely, there's just nothing left of what was. It's in those moments that truly radical innovation takes root sometimes. And we see that with post-World War II Japan, for example. It was only when a guy named Toyota said, well, everything is rubble around me, and yet we have to pick up and move forward. That's when you invent a fundamentally new approach to manufacturing. That's how the Toyota production system came into its own. That eventually became the lean production system. And it's only by blowing it all up and starting over, that really is that liberating moment. Well, maybe this is ours. So let us, we ignore it at our peril. Maybe this is our opportunity to do things in a fundamentally different way. We find inspiration for the things I'm about to talk about in this concept called Jugad innovation. We first see smatterings of this appearing in Western literature on or around 2012. And the essence of this is that, the West, at the risk of oversimplifying our situation, we've had the luxury of being fat and happy for a pretty long time. And that has necessarily set the tone for a lot of our innovative activities. We made big, expensive R&D labs because we could. But the gentleman you see in this figure here, he didn't have that, but he had to figure a way to get the job done anyway. And therein lies the DNA for frugal innovation, is this contribution from the Indian subcontinent called Jugad innovation. There are 6 major axioms or principles to this idea of frugal innovation, and I'll be exploring them in turn. The first principle is engage and iterate. Like I said, this Western institution of large corporate R&D labs, well-heeled, all cashed up, that was, I think of Xerox, Palo Alto Research Center, and Bell Labs, and those have kind of gone the way of the dodo. They're not really what they were. They might still exist, but probably not in the form that they used to be. And so what do we see working a little bit better now? Well, now we see examples in the marketplace of what works better, it seems, is that when you instead of relying on those big, expensive R&D departments, you basically kind of just start listening very attentively to what is your customer saying, what are they doing in their natural environment, and then you iteratively kind of look at what they're doing, go back and improve your product, check and see how it works, go back and improve your product again. So here's a story that warrants telling. There's this product called Intuit Quicken. Now, the CEO of Intuit, he had this to be perfectly honest, it sounds like a little bit strange behavior to me, but apparently, as the legend goes, he would literally hang out around Staples stores. So he would kind of just put on your regular person clothes and hang around Staples, which is like an Office Works, and he would see people pick up the box of the product that his company was selling. He would say, excuse me, I'm paraphrasing, I wasn't there, but he was like, can I, come home with you? And I want to watch you use this product. I want to see you load it. I want to see how it works. How do you kind of make this wrap around your life? And I doubt his success rate would be very high with that invitation. But apparently some people would say, yeah, sure, let's do this. And so it was through that process that he would see where were the pain points when these people are trying to get the software going. Where were the pain points when they tried to use it? How was it delivering value and utility in their lives? He wanted to see that firsthand. And slightly less creepy than the follow them home strategy, probably with fewer restraining orders, I expect, is Fujitsu. Fujitsu engineers, they wanted to kind of get a real appreciation for, how can our digital technologies, how specifically, where can we add our digital gadgets in a way that's going to breathe life and kind of deliver value into this Mandarin Orange facility. So what did they do? Rather than kind of looking at it through binoculars from across great distances, they rolled up their sleeves and they just got in there. They just said, look, we're going to have to become Mandarin farmers for a little while and see how that works. And it's only by doing that and getting the dirt under your fingernails, that's how you figure out, oh, that's how this works. This is the information that they needed. Here's when they needed that information. And they just got in there and became Mandarin farmers for a while. Now, how do we kind of translate that principle of engage and iterate? How do we drag that in a useful way to the resource sector? Here's my personal take on that. When I kind of have deep and meaningful conversations with resource managers about the relationships that they have with service companies and suppliers who would be in a position to provide new technologies to them, one of the things that quickly comes into focus is that these are fraught relationships. They are not healthy bilateral conversations. Very frequently, the people at the top of the food chain are speaking to suppliers and service contractors with their boot firmly on their throat, basically kind of saying, give me this. I'm going to give you a 5-cent profit on a ton of this stuff, and I'm not going to, I'm not worried about your welfare or how you feel about it. I'm just going to tell you how it's going to be. And if you ask them at the bar after the conference is over, and you ask the service contractors, how do you feel about this relationship? They feel abused, they feel beaten, and they'll be darned if they're going to volunteer great ideas about how you could do it all better. And so one of the things that I think would be low-hanging fruit, I suppose that's a bit of a tipping my hat to the Mandarin example, but the low-hanging fruit here is that if we can improve that relationship with those suppliers, with those service contractors, it could bring about a profoundly different conversation with them. We could kind of get that iterative loop happening in a way that I don't think happens very well right now. That would resemble more what happens in a place like Toyota, or I've done some work in Intel. They have a decidedly different approach to how they manage suppliers. They work with suppliers. Suppliers are constantly putting new inventive ideas in front of them, and they iteratively kind of work through these things to see how much mileage we can get out of these concepts. And I see that happening far less in the resource and energy sector, and I think it comes down to those relationships very often. Principle 2, flex your assets. Do a little thought experiment in your mind. Ask yourself, what's the production and the distribution assets that you have laying around in your enterprise somewhere that sometimes sit idle? And the reason that I've got these logos up here, Uber and Airbnb. Let's kind of think about what is the raison d'etre for those businesses. What they do really, what they've laid bare is the fact that there were assets sitting there doing nothing most of the time. Uber is about making if you kind of didn't have Uber, a car sits in a driveway, like 80% of the time, not moving anywhere? Well, so Uber basically said, how do we unleash the potential of that? How do we squeeze the asset and make it sweat for us? Airbnb, it's about taking people's houses that weren't being used as houses. They were just sitting there, nobody in them. Well, how do we turn that into money? So what's the idle asset that might be somewhere in your enterprise? And so that's the beginning point of this. Now, why not consider allowing other companies, maybe even rivals, to use that? Couple of examples. Mars, the global food manufacturer, I'm a big fan from way back. They cooperate with competitors to share distribution vehicle fleets. Why not? That was never the basis for differentiation. Who cares what vehicle is bringing the chocolates around? It doesn't matter. So if that was never the bleeding edge of competition, why not share the vehicle? The second example, in Africa and India, it's been common for a very long time, and I think in the West we're starting to see this also, where telecoms companies, they'll share mobile phone towers. So, well, why not? Again, that's not the basis for technical differentiation, so why not? And what about opportunities for piggybacking? Are there other people that are already doing the same milk run that you need to do? Maybe they're not in the same industry as you. For example, healthcare firms in Africa, they piggyback on Coca-Cola's temperature-controlled supply network to deliver life-saving AIDS medicines to make sure that they get to the remote villages they need to get to. They're not in direct competition. Why not? You got a refrigerated truck already going on the same route. And to kind of drag this back to the resource sector, I want to tell you about an example I saw in the United States some years ago. Basically, you had, those red dots, those are oil and gas platforms that are in the Gulf of Mexico. Yeah, that's a lot, right? And so there's this optic fiber that basically kind of makes this loop around the Gulf of Mexico, that all of those platforms, without any regard to what logo was, how they were branded, didn't matter. Everybody signed up and said, look, the basis for differentiation between and among us, it has nothing to do with data transfer rates. So let's just all throw some money in the hat and make this loop that goes around the Gulf. Why can't we piggyback on this resource for all of us? We'll compete elsewhere. We just won't compete on this. And data is the new oil, right? So if data is such an important asset these days, are we doing enough to share data with the partners and the suppliers that are in your network? Because there's tremendous value to be enjoyed if you can let everybody know what is happening. If they can put the finger on the pulse of the patient and know what's happening with your assets, just like you do, that's going to open up new possibilities for innovation and collaboration. Okay, principle 3, create sustainable solutions. Now, in no way do I want to detract from the importance of environment and ecology, but I'm telling you that you don't have to care about the environment or ecology because of reasons of ecology. Care about it because this is the frugal thing to do. Don't waste because you want to be cheap. The environment, we'll work, we continue to make gains on that. Of course we should. But if that doesn't motivate you, then please feel free to be motivated by this. Let's be cheap. Because when we care about the environment, we're not throwing things away. There's less stuff kind of being just thrown into the atmosphere or buried somewhere. Let's talk about some examples here. We got this company, ATMI. They're basically removing gold microcircuitry from consumer electronics. They're getting, those big bullion bar of gold? They're getting one of those every 2 days. They're generating just by going through old electronics. And how about this? One process's waste could actually be a feedstock input for somebody else. So I don't know how many people here have a lot of exposure to the IT sector, but these, when you got these big, huge server farms, they crank out so much heat. I don't know if you knew this, but if you kind of, this is kind of a little factoid from the folks at Intel. Heat management has actually become a significant technical barrier to semiconductors. The heat generation of a semiconductor on a small chip, the per unit area wattage output is actually equivalent to what you get out of a steam iron. So the problem of how to get rid of all that heat that a semiconductor is generating, this is a really big deal. Now you take one of those chips and you kind of scale that up to a whole server farm. Well, my goodness, we're talking about massive amounts of heat we got to get rid of. But what can we do with it? At the moment, our best solution is, well, let's just put those server farms up in Iceland or Finland or something and then put a heat sink that runs through the Arctic Ocean. And we'll just kind of treat it like waste. But does it have to be waste? Could we be doing something a little more benevolent with that? Could that waste heat be an input, a feedstock input to somebody else's industrial process? Probably, but we really haven't taken that seriously yet. So let's apply that logic to everything. Where can we do that in the resource and mining and energy sectors? Principle 4, shape customer behavior. Oftentimes, our customers are way more wasteful, than the companies that supply them. And for example, I've got this story here with Unilever. They estimate that half of the company's water consumption, it relates to how customers use the product rather than what Unilever is doing in and of itself. Well, if you know that that's true, if you know that the real waste is happening one level removed from you in the supply network, well, what can you do? What levers can you pull? What buttons can you push to try to solve that? One solution is visualization. Can you make that other person, that other party, make them acutely aware, when you do this, this is what happens? Are there tricks that we can apply that will make that clear to them? One trick that we see in the marketplace is that of social comparison. We already see, I know I'm an Origin Energy customer, and they already have this thing that says, did you know, so this is what your electricity usage, they even have kind of a little pictogram of a house, and here's how much energy your neighbors have been using. Simply having that neighborhood comparison, you versus your neighbors, the evidence shows that reduces people's energy consumption by 2%. Just by letting you know what the Joneses are up to, makes you a little more conscientious about it. Maybe I could turn on my AC one day less, So these things matter. Or gamification. Principle number 5, co-create value with prosumers. Now, if I'm going to run around using made-up words, the least I can do is explain to you what I mean by them. A prosumer is this new word that's popped up in the last few years. It's the coming together of, these are people who consume an innovation or product while simultaneously being in a position to produce it. So think of people who have solar panels on their house, for example. They consume electricity and simultaneously they're producing some of it. That is a prosumer, okay? So people who they want to use something, but they're also in a position to kind of make it. And the 3 best examples of the behavior, and I try to kind of make this kind of I fanned it out generationally. So we have, to my thinking, from different decades here, we've got the professor from Gilligan's Island, who with coconut shells and vines could manufacture nuclear reactors, but strangely not create a raft. Still can't explain that one all these years later. So the professor from Gilligan's Island, MacGyver from the 80s, and depending on how young you are, Mr. Maker. Okay, now all of these guys have one thing in common. They know how to kind of take things that are just random materials around them and turn them into something beautiful and genuinely useful, with the notable exception of a raft from the professor, as we've already covered. Okay, now we've seen some technological developments that have really unshackled and kind of fanned the embers of this behavior. We've seen that there's been a precipitous decline in the cost of 3D printing, open source hardware and open source software, and it's kind of given everybody this, for want of a better term, almost like a Lego kit or a series of Lego kits where everybody can start to really get in there and monkey around to solve problems. So now everybody is empowered to be a MacGyver or a professor from Gilligan's Island or a Mr. Maker. And we're seeing these peer-to-peer sharing platforms popping up spontaneously all over the place that make it possible for fellow enthusiasts to collaborate on projects that they share a passion for. IKEA has a great example of this, and they have taken some steps to try to facilitate this. They had so many people using IKEA products in ways that they simply had not envisaged that they kind of made this website, IKEAhackers.net. And they basically just said, let the people speak. They just kind of made this website and said, all right, everybody, tell us what you came up with. One of the real chestnuts that I absolutely loved here was, there was this, the Grundtal, you know how all the IKEA products always have a fancy Swedish name? Well, even their toilet roll dispenser had that. The Grundtal toilet roll holder, and my apologies if the pronunciation was less than Swedish on that. But people figured out a while back that not only was it great as a toilet roll holder, you could turn it into a really snazzy looking headphone hanger. And so, all of a sudden, there's like 1 million orders for these things because people are like, I need something to hold my kids' headphones. And so people started buying it, not for toilet paper, but for that. IKEA never thought of that. That was letting the people speak, and that's what they said. So what IKEA has done is they've provided the forum for letting that conversation happen. And then they just keep their ear to the ground and they listen attentively and see what the people are saying. So not everybody here sells flat pack furniture. So how do we make that relevant to the resources and energy sector? To borrow a phrase from a professor at MIT, we got to figure out how we democratize your innovation process. All right, now we know how IKEA did it. How can we get more democratic input, more prosumer input into the innovation processes happening in your backyard? Now, hackathons are already happening. I think with limited success. I don't think that we've changed the world quite as much with hackathons as we probably thought we were gonna. A lot of companies come back with mixed results on that. So is that the only trick that we can think of? Maybe we can kind of come up with something different. But we need to borrow from Professor Eric von Hippel from MIT, how can we democratize the innovation process? Principle number 6, make innovative friends. That innovation model I spoke of earlier, the Palo Alto Research Center owned by Xerox, IBM's research center in upstate New York, these well-heeled, well-funded R&D labs where everything happens on one bench under one roof, that's not really the way things happen anymore. That was the era of closed innovation. That was when you had this innovation funnel, mostly what you see here on the left, where it's kind of mostly happening, where it's kind of being shepherded through one organization. And you're kind of winnowing and paring down as you go from left to right. What's more likely to happen now is this idea of open innovation, because no one company is going to have a monopoly on all the good ideas. Great ideas are going to come from your suppliers, from your customers, from the prosumers we talked about earlier, but also from other industries you didn't even think were going to be relevant. They might be coming up with some humdinger ideas that if you only were dialed into the conversation, you would go, that is an amazing idea. How do I bring that over to where I need it? But there's another side of the coin. You might be coming up with humdinger ideas that can be exported to whole other industries that you're not even talking to. How do we get those conversations started? How do we put up a big antenna to make sure that you're receptive and listening to the great ideas happening elsewhere in the market that otherwise you might not even see, get those imported to your industry, and simultaneously also figure out how can we export your good ideas to other sectors that aren't adjacent and not known to you yet. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer.